All right, welcome to the SBL panel on Africana Biblical Interpretation, Africana Biblical Studies. We are excited to present an august panel in lieu of our international meeting. Our panel today will consist of Dr. Margaret Amer, Dr. Michael Joseph Brown, Dr. Famola Olajede, Dr. Justin Michael Reed, Eric A. Thomas, and Dr. Annie Tinsley. And I'm excited to introduce our panel. My name is Herbert Marbury. I'm Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I will be moderating the panel. Moderating, I think, is a strong word. I will be facilitating the conversation. Before we begin, I want to thank Latoya Leary at SBL for all the work that she has done to bring us together and to facilitate the logistics and to make this panel happen. So thank you very much, Latoya. And let me begin by way of introduction. First, Dr. Margaret Amer serves as the First Presbyterian Church, Shreveport, D. Thomason Professor of New Testament Studies at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She's the first woman of color to be promoted to full professor on that campus. Dr. Amer is an immigrant from the Caribbean with roots in many Caribbean islands. Her father and uncle also earned PhDs in New Testament, making her the third in her family with this degree. After 14 years of teaching in a historically Black seminary, the Interdenominational Theological Center, Dr. Amer joined the faculty of Austin Seminary in 2017. Her work includes considering migration, postcoloniality, and Islander readings, and Black feminist womanist thought in relationship to the New Testament. Welcome, Dr. Amer. Dr. Michael Joseph Brown serves as the 17th president and professor of New Testament and Christian origins at Payne Theological Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio. An advocate for inclusive theological education, Dr. Brown has expanded Payne's educational reach into the Caribbean, Ghana, Zambia, and South Africa, graduating the first class in 2020. Prior to his arrival at Payne, he was Associate Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He spent several years as the director of Emory's Graduate Division of Religion, and he prides himself on the diversity of the student body during his tenure. Dr. Brown is also the author of several books and articles, including Blackening the Bible, The Aims of African American Biblical Scholarship. He's an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Brown received a BA from Vanderbilt University and the MDiv and PhD from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Brown. Dr. Famola Olajede is a researcher with the Gender Unit of the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch University of South Africa. Her academic interests include gender and feminist hermeneutics, wisdom literature, Old Testament studies, migration studies, and African biblical interpretation. Dr. Olajede is a fellow of the UBIAS network, and she has done research at Princeton Theological Seminary, Alexander von Humboldt University, Berlin, Germany, and the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, Netherlands, among other institutions. She is the coordinator of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians in South Africa. In addition to publishing many articles, she has also co-edited the book, Teaching for Change, Essays on Pedagogy, Gender, Health, and Theology in Africa. Welcome, Dr. Olajede. Dr. Justin Michael Reed is an assistant professor of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He earned his BA in African and African American Studies from Stanford and a Master's of Theological Studies in Hebrew from Harvard. For his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, he brought these interests together in a dissertation that argues for a new interpretation of Noah's curse in Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 29, a text that is notorious for being weaponized against Afro-diasporic peoples. Currently, his major academic interests include reception history, ideological criticism, and concepts of race and ethnicity as they relate to biblical texts. Welcome, Dr. Reed. Dr. Eric A. Thomas is a PhD candidate in New Testament and early Christianity at Drew University and the interim pastor of Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. His research focuses on minoritized biblical criticism informed by queer of color critique. He's an adjunct professor at Harvard Seminary, Kean University, and the New School, where he has taught a course called Queering and Decolonizing Theology each spring since 2017. In the fall of 2021, he's looking forward to premiering The Origins and Spiritualities of the Black Lives Matter Movement, also at the New School. When not pastoring, teaching, and completing his dissertation in the midst of pandemic politics protests, he enjoys naps and dreaming of a world where Black futures can be more expansive, joy-filled, and pleasurable than the myriad quotidian quests to survive systems of whiteness and anti-Blackness. Welcome. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. Dr. Annie Tinsley is the Director of Divinity Programs and Assistant Professor of New Testament at Shaw University Divinity School. She has a PhD in Religion and Theology from the University of Birmingham, in the UK. Her research interests include rereading biblical literature from an African-American post-colonial perspective. Dr. Tinsley's interests also stem into the cultural linguistic aspects of African Americans and how language impacted the development of their culture with respect to slavery and the civil rights movement in the United States. Her present research focuses on gentrification and Middle Passages. Welcome, Dr. Tinsley. Welcome to you all. You all have rich experience and varied interests, and I'm looking forward to a robust and interesting conversation. So let us begin, and I'm going to pose the first question. I'll begin with Margaret. But I pose the first question to all of us. So, Margaret, if you would, tell us how you first came to focus your scholarship on what I'm broadly calling Africana biblical interpretation. What was the field of biblical studies like at the time? What particular questions did this focus help you answer, and what attracted you to it?
Thank you, Herbert. It's good to be part of the panel, and it's good to be among this august group. I fell into the question of Africana biblical studies. It was not a primary interest of mine. When I went to seminary, it was the 1990s. And I happened to be at Union Seminary at a time when Vincent Wimbush, James Washington, and James Cone were all on the faculty, along with Dolores Williams. So it was a time when the question of African hermeneutic, African-American theology, African-American hermeneutic, African-American ways of reading was very much present. Vincent began his African-Americans and the Bible project just after I finished my coursework. So I didn't get a chance to take the courses that he was teaching leading up to it, but I was very much present for that conference. So when I was at Union, this was just a live question. It wasn't an unusual question to ask. I was a bit torn because as I said in my bio, my background is Caribbean. It's not African American. So it's Africana, but it's not part of that specific diaspora, branch of the diaspora out of which Vincent and Dolores and James Washington emerged. And so I always had a problem trying to find ways to connect those things. So I was really at a loss as to what I was going to write about. And then I went to ITC in 2001. And about a month after I got to ITC, 9/11 happened. And I lost 6 months of even beginning to think about my dissertation. And I found myself, for the first time in my entire immigrant life in this country, in a majority Black space that was African American. I had never been in a majority Black space that was African American until that point, and I was in my 20s. Or 30s even. So that was a cultural shock and a cultural shift, and the time to get to know a culture that had pretty much built this country from the ground up, and began to understand some of the nuances and the ways in which people were moving. I was looking for a dissertation topic, a way to frame the question, and I was in the library on Clark Atlanta campus, and I happened upon the writings of Frederick Douglass. And I was looking at the narratives and wasn't really seeing much. And then I saw John Blassingame's set of his speeches. And I started opening them, and I started seeing Bible, 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 and Blassingame hadn't cataloged any of it. So I then started to go, I just went home and started cataloging, how is this man using the Bible? And then how is this Bible acting as a way of speaking to and speaking about the culture in which he was located? And to me, that made sense. I come from a family of preachers. I come from a family of scholars, but also a family of preachers. And both my uncle and my father used the Bible to speak to the culture. And so I came in through that way into this discussion. And then I taught at ITC for 14 years, and you can't really teach next door to Randall Bailey and in his department without attending to this stuff, because he will tell you. So I was kind of mentored by my students into this discussion. And because I was the only woman in the department, I was the one who was forced to learn about womanism because the men wouldn't teach it. So I did. So that's how I came at it. I come at it as an immigrant in this discussion. What has been interesting in the last few years for me is I've started to have good conversations with people like Steve Davidson and Althea Spencer and Minion Jacobs and Ronald Shaw and some of the Caribana Africana scholars in the discipline, and beginning to see how post-coloniality, the questions of neocolonialism and post-colonialism are beginning to shape our work from that lens. And so I'm beginning to put my finger into what is Caribbean theology doing? Because my father did his dissertation before all of that became a rich discourse. And I was never part of that conversation because I left the islands before I was part of that conversation. So that gives you some idea. I feel as if I'm kind of a sojourner in this. And I'm happy to be part of the conversation. I'm happy to listen, and I'm happy to learn.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to turn to Michael, unless there are others who want to jump in and participate more improvisationally. If not, then.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for having this panel and for inviting me. I appreciate the consideration. I'm similar in some ways to Margaret. I didn't start out with a focus on or an interest in Africana biblical interpretation. I was more of I was at the University of Chicago, very traditional New Testament program, and my interests were kind of developing along the lines of New Testament and material culture, which is still there. But I ended up getting involved in, at the time, African-American biblical interpretation, because there was a series being written, I forget which publisher it is, but Victor Anderson and Anthony Penn were the editors, and they wanted a volume on biblical interpretation, and they asked me if I would do it. And so I went on a quest to learn everything I could and to read and study. And it was not only illuminating, but has influenced my my scholarship ever since. And so I've been very excited to see how this discipline is working itself out and where it's going to go in the future. especially now, given my present circumstance, where I keenly see how it empowers our students.
Thank you. Let's turn now to Funlola. I think Funlola, I think you're still on mute.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's quite all right.
Yeah, just a word of thanks to Benny for asking me to join this conversation, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I would say that I didn't originally start out as an Old Testament scholar. I'm a late comer to theology because my background is in linguistics. But I would say I came into Africana biblical hermeneutics by default. You know, I was co-opted into it by my supervisor, Professor Hendrik Bosman, who is retired now and happens to be a white man, an African white man. So that was quite something because this was in 2007. Now, I was focused on doing an exegetical study for my doctoral dissertation because I like the text the way it is, just pure, you know. But he gently and deftly steered me into contextual hermeneutical space, you know. And at that time, I was helping out in the department with the compilation of a database of scholarly works in Old Testament and New Testament in Africa. So while doing these compilations, trying to get all the authors, what they've written about in both Old and New Testaments, it was not difficult to notice that Africana, I say Africana in quote, I'll explain later, biblical hermeneutics was not only short of female biblical interpreters in Africa. You could count on your fingertips the number of female scholars who showed interest in the Old Testament, and specifically in wisdom literature, which I eventually focused on. So there was this urgency in my heart to fill that gaping hole in this aspect of biblical interpretation. So in other words, I'm not talking about African biblical interpretation as a whole, but specifically the feminist area. So my dissertation, therefore, turned out to be a contextual, theological, and feminist interpretation of the figure of woman wisdom in the book of Proverbs. So I'm not just an Africana biblical hermeneut, but specifically feminist. So I like to always nuance that when I talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Funlola. Let's turn now to Justin.
Hi, everyone. So when I started learning about biblical studies in the 2000s, it was after Michael had already published that book on that introduction, Blackening of the Bible. And so I started learning about the discipline at a time when I feel like I should have known more about African-American biblical interpretation as a subset of Africana studies in general, or Africana biblical interpretation in general. But my path, like a few of the people have mentioned already, did not begin with my own people, with what I was already naturally interested in. So I came to college thinking I want to study things that are about my people. So I got a major in African and African-American studies. And from growing up, I had been in spaces where the Bible was important, but the type of attention that the church I went to growing up gave to the Bible didn't match the type of critical inquiry that I was passionate about in school. And so I had no idea that people were asking those type of questions of the Bible until halfway through undergrad. I realized there were, and started to take classes that had to do with biblical studies. And in those contexts, it was white males and Jewish males who had very historical critical goals and pursued traditional forms of criticism that were teaching me. And so I was under the impression that this is what biblical studies from an academic standpoint looks like. And at that point, I felt like I had two passions, and the two would never meet. So when I started my master's degree, I assumed, okay, I'm going to choose between which of these two passions. Well, I got a BA in studying Black people, so now I'm going to study the Bible for this master's. And it was towards the end of my master's degree, and at the start of my coursework for my PhD, that I started to find the resources of scholars who were asking the type of questions and engaging with the text in ways that felt refreshing and felt natural from my own context. And so some of the things that I was starting to see ranged from, in my church context, growing up, going to an AME church, we saw ourselves in the Bible. We thought of the people in the Bible as Black. And so there were interpretations by people like Charles Cofer who were trying to put some scholarly rigor behind that type of claim. And I said, oh, these are the same things that my people are asking about. And then there were also interpretations that I came to see as more nuanced and personally more interesting, that went beyond identification and are thinking about, okay, me as a contextualized being in front of this text as a reader, how does that influence what I see in the text differently from another contextualized being? And specifically, what about the Black experience is a part of that? And that was, to me, such a powerful perspective, the thing that I really held on to, because it's an assertion that there's something valuable about my life experiences that I'm bringing to interpreting the Bible. And so in some ways I matter, and so does another person for their specific experiences. And that was something that I felt was missing from the traditional way in which I learned about the Bible before that. And so for those reasons, I really latched on to what I was learning about African American biblical interpretation when it came across my field of vision.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Let's turn now to Eric.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. It's great to be with you all. I think that as a student at the ITC, I celebrate that moment in time, Dr. Amer, where we were able to do an entire course on womanist biblical interpretation and spend 14 weeks only on womanist and Black feminist biblical scholars. And so that was a celebration. And it might have been in that class or kind of doing later reading where I think it was Emily Towns in The Womanist Dancing Mind who said, let us be expansive in our particularities. And I think that was, the context of that was, she was speaking to American womanist scholars about the plight of Black women in the diaspora, which of course made me think about same gender loving people in the diaspora. As someone who kind of grew up in the Paris is Burning kind of generation, I recognize that there are certain privileges that I have as a same gender loving man who lives in New York, who can go to clubs and bars and affirming churches, in comparison to sodomy laws that are still very present in Africa, in context to the ways that mobs commit violence upon queer people in the Caribbean. And I was noticing that like some of this violence is biblical. Like they would take the queer person and chop them up into pieces like Judges 19. And what is that about? And so there was a connection. I felt like not only was I wanting to identify myself in that Black church experience of can I get a witness? Like I know I was there, but I wasn't finding myself in Dr. Blount's text, but also to be connected with queer folk in Kingston who are living in sewers and in places. And so the first things that I started writing about were imagining the man with a legion in same gender loving perspective, especially considering the way that the community is okay with allowing him to be a living person in a dead place and being invested in that. And a later essay for Fordham University Press, like outside are the dogs of Revelation, and the way that Mugabe calls people, queer folks, pigs and dogs, and seeing that kind of connectedness, and continuing to wonder about the implications for biblical interpretation for people that are on the continent and that are in the Caribbean countries whose lived experiences are not being represented, are not being asked for, right? And I think another part of that is, I wanna make sure I get in the hallways of SBL. So where it started out for me was finding the place, usually in the basement, where African-American biblical interpretation was happening, and finding the place, usually in the basement, where African biblical interpretation was happening, and the same for post-colonial, and the same for contextual. And it felt to me like Africana happened as we passed each other in the hallways, going to our particular parts. And I think that that's also what the potential of Africana biblical interpretation as we are still forming it can be. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And finally, let's turn to Annie.
Hi, thank you, Benny, and all who thought it enough of me to select me for this. I tried to get out of it, Benny, but it's not that I don't want to do this. I just don't feel comfortable in this kind of environment. But going back to the question, the only HBCU I went to was Hampton. Since then, I have been in PWIs, and now I'm at Shaw, which is definitely the mother of HBCUs. But when I realized what I wanted to do, it was something that I didn't want to do. I did not want to be the voice of African Americans. I didn't want to be that Black voice because I was in this white society most of my postgraduate days. And so when I got into this, it was kind of like a fluke. I was in an Old Testament class with Dr. Leo Perdue at TCU, and he was talking about post-colonialism, and it just struck me that this was something that needed to be pursued. I have always been in the New Testament. It was prophesied to me at one of my schools that I'm going to be in Hebrew Bible, but I was like, no. Nothing wrong with it. Just I have always been a critic of Pauline studies and a critic of those writers, not writers, but the writers of the letters, because I kind of felt that some voices were not being heard. If you know, the letters were written and published, but you never heard what the problem was, except through the letters. And so when we started talking about post-colonialism and marginalization, and it just struck me to say, hey, this is something that I really could pursue. And I started out with the book of Colossians and, you know, this whole Colossian heresy thing. And I debunked that. It's like there was no heresy there because we didn't hear from them. We heard from the writer who was supposed to be Paul or somebody who was like him. So I just wanted to pursue this. I wanted to pursue post-colonial studies. And at that time, there were not many African Americans or Black people doing that. As a matter of fact, I tried to get into my PhD program here in the States, and there was really nobody who was seriously looking at that. So I applied to a couple of schools overseas, and lo and behold, Sugi found out what I was doing, and he asked me if he could work with me. And you know that he called me from the UK. I'm in Texas, and when he said that, I took the phone and said, because I had come to know that he is like, you know, the guy, you know. So I was able to study with him, and it just started there. And I was just so excited to be able to do this, and I didn't want to be the voice of Black America. I always say that from an American, Black American or African American perspective, I want to make that clear. Not that I'm ashamed of that, it's just that I am not that voice, even though it felt like it at that time. And that's how I pursue my work. I pursue my work from a perspective that is inclusive. Because when you think about post-coloniality, Black Americans didn't really feel it then. But as the conversations now have come to show us that this is a global thing, and that from what I see, the problem began with colonization and how that has impacted. And so the Bible, for me, still searching, still looking at instances of empire and imperialism, and not just from a Black perspective, but it's how empire has impacted the writing, the canon, how all of that has impacted the study of biblical studies. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Annie. And so now that we've made our introductory remarks and displayed our varying points of entry into the enterprise, let's let the conversation begin. I'm no longer going to call on you because class doesn't start for another 2 months, and I'm sure that since we've all just finished our semesters, we'd like to move away from that format. And so let me throw out the next question, and I'll invite you all to respond as you're so moved, and respond to each other as you are so moved and engaged. So what is your sense of Africana biblical interpretation at this moment? And what do you see as exciting, and what do you see as limiting? And I want to think about that question broadly, of course, but I also want to think about it in a more focused way. That is, in terms of scholarly possibilities. That is, as I think about that, I'm thinking about the means and possibilities of publication, and what can we publish, and also professional opportunities. That is, can we get tenure writing this stuff? I mean, I think, you know, some of the practical concerns that we all think about in the back of our minds as we are being moved and led by the Spirit and our to pursue our academic questions and cultural questions. So let's begin there.
I'm going to be brave and jump in and just say, I think that what's exciting about Africana biblical interpretation now is that we have the opportunity to create our agendas if we take that opportunity. When we, Africana studies always poses the question, from whence does Africana come, right? And so is it from the continent to the diaspora, from the diaspora to the continent? Is it both? Is it simultaneous? And I think that the answer to all of that is yes, right? I think that there are opportunities for us to lay claim to what does it mean, especially to be a person of African descent post pandemic, post 2020, post the Trump era. What does racialized capitalism look like? What does the status of the immigrant look like? What is the status of the person of color scholar in the academy look like? I mean, Herbert, you asked a question about tenure, and I mean, I think we should ask a question about tenure, frankly, given some of the news that we've seen. And so perhaps, and again, I'll be the junior scholar and perhaps be the naive one here, whereas the 20th century was a period of time where African-American and Caribbean and African scholars and post-colonial scholars were trying to prove to the academy that we can be Bible scholars. Now that we know that, we can get on some other kind of stuff. How do we rebuild our folks? How do we enrich and ennoble our people on our own perspectives, and to say to the SBL, this is what it is? And I'll stop there before I get myself in trouble. But I think that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house.
I'm glad Eric went first. I didn't want to give the impression that I was actively publishing in the area, but one of the things I've noticed is that it kind of a really great expansion of Africana biblical interpretation into all kinds of areas that didn't exist when I wrote Blackening of the Bible, and some of which I would hope would come to fruition, and I think it has in many respects, especially around LGBT contextual interpretation. So I'm really grateful for that. I think the limitation is what it's always been, which is the curriculum and the imaginations of scholars to see and to think about what is quote unquote valid or adequate biblical interpretation. I will say that although it would seem heresy to some to say that you don't teach in the kind of traditional historical critical model, and maybe you don't do away with that entirely, but it is I think not only possible but advantageous to bring in the importance of contextualized interpretations, and so why not require it? I know at my institution we require that you take it. It's not a negotiable course. And so in that sense, we're telling our students and the world that we see this as being on par with any other form of biblical interpretation. As far as tenure goes, I mean, well, there are two questions there, I think. One is, what's the future of tenure? Now, I think at Research One schools, that's probably not a big question now, but for other schools, it is an existential question, and one that I think we're gonna see fewer and fewer tenured positions going forward. So maybe I don't know. Maybe that's not as pressing as we sometimes think it is. But I think if we're thinking about tenure as a process in which our work gets compared, gets judged by our peers who are doing that kind of work. I think that the environment is much better now than it was back in 2005 when Blackening came out, you know, where you had to explain why it is you thought this was a worthy endeavor. I think now that's not as much of a question, and there are people out there who have standing, who can analyze your work. And so I think that it's become more acceptable among, let's say, our peers who are not of color. But let me say this too, though, and this was always something that disturbed me, and that is, if one of my colleagues who was not of color wrote a book that was esoteric and people didn't understand necessarily what the book was trying to do, they got tenure because they were considered brilliant. If we, in doing the same kind of thing, people scratched their heads and wondered. And I think that day, I hope, is passing away.
Yes, Michael, I think you have a point, really good point there when you speak about being noticed. I think that's what you were saying by the wider world, say the white world. I think that what's happening now with us as Black Americans and Black scholars, that we're listening more to each other. It's not so important to many of us that others hear us. That as long as we hear each other, and that makes us a majority rather than a minority. And the other thing, as far as younger scholars, I mean, the conversations I've had with younger scholars has been amazing. I mean, I was like, whoa, really? You know, well, I have a student who wanted to rewrite the canon. She's like, you know, all that apocryphal work, you know, that is out there. Why do we, you know? And I had to, it gave me pause, because that's the kind of thing that, you know, that I looked at. But then as far as tenure goes, I've given up on that, working at HBCU, but the contract keeps coming, so I'm good. But the idea that tenure was such a big deal, and it held such a hold on people that, you know, you wouldn't want to apply to a school unless they had tenure, and not thinking that, well, what can I do at this school? You know, how can I impact the students? You know, that kind of thing. But that's it. That's what I have to say. I have to charge my phone. So I mean, my computer. Sorry.
Can I jump in, Annie? I agree with you. I think you're right. You're spot on, and in what you were saying.
So for me, one of the things that's been interesting and exciting is to see the advent of a kind of self-reflective post-coloniality. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of Chanel Smith. I'm thinking of the work of Shively Smith. I'm thinking of the work of Rhonda Shad. I'm thinking of the ways in which Black descendants of slavery in this country are also looking at the role that this country plays in the oppression of Black people outside of this country. And they're positioning in that, whether or not they want it, whether or not they chose it. You know, as I used to say to my students at ITC, my cousin died in Panama in the war. His grandfather was a Panamanian, but he went to war because that was the way that he could get money to go to college. And so you've got wonderful parallels between the Jews who decided to become Roman soldiers, right, in the ancient world, and all of this. So this kind of self-reflective post-coloniality, what Chanel Smith calls ambivalence, I think is very, very rich, very fertile ground for beginning to have a kind of a more expansive, more self-aware conversation of our place as African diasporic people at the center of Rome, living in Rome and participating in that to whatever extent that is for those of us who live in this country. So there's that one piece I think that's really, really amazing. I'm so grateful for, especially on the continent, the push for open access materials, because not only does that benefit those who are outside of this country. It deeply benefits scholars in this country to have access to what's going on in Stellenbosch, to have access to what's going on in Petersburg, to have access to what's going on all over the continent, to have access to what's going on in the Caribbean. When we didn't have access before, those conversations were cut off. Now we can actually, grab those. We can get onto HTS and the other journals out there and read what's going on in the scholarship and the discourse outside of this country. That, I think, has the potential, if we're intentional about engaging that, of really reshaping the way we talk to each other about what we mean by Africana biblical studies, so that it doesn't become a kind of myopic focus on one culture or a mythos of a lost past that may not have really existed in the first place. So there's that. There was a third thing, but it will slosh back around. So I will stop there.
And I just want to add to that, that not only the afterlives of slavery in the United States, but the afterlives of the missionary project outside of the United States. And, just being amazed, Margaret, you've been to Matanzas in Cuba, where it's brought to our attention that in the ports where the ships came would also be the Catholic Church, or other churches, which would baptize the inhabitants and send them on to where they were going. And to think about things like the Westminster Confession of Faith that is happening at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, and all of these kind of like church father commentaries that become kind of the bedrock of historical critical, while they are participating in this kind of missionary project to Africa, Asia, South America, the Americas, and to kind of reflect back on like what are the after effects of those things, I think are part of this project as well.
This was the third thought I had. It came back around. I knew it would. Vincent started something that I don't think anybody fully took him up on, which was the idea of thinking about lived life and actually studying lived life. He did this with art, he did this with history, he did this with theater and literature and all that other stuff. It would be fascinating, and I think it would be rich if folks, instead of allowing the studies of the Black church to be in the Africana Studies department, and then having Bible be something separate, if we were to pair up with a sociologist to do that kind of work that was observing and taking data and actually looking at particular churches and how they are engaging with text in particular ways, that's data driven and not simply anecdotal. There's nothing wrong with anecdotal. There's nothing wrong with claiming our own lived history, but it's always particular, right? It's always a peculiar history. And it's always coming through one person's experience or one group's experience of what it means to be Black in America. What would happen if we were to start thinking sociologically about actually studying this, actually observing how Bible is used, actually observing how people interact with this? I taught a course with a sociologist on my campus this semester, and one of my students observed services that were online from a Black church, and then she went and read Vincent's book, and she said, "Oh, I get what's going on," and she began to piece stuff together. It was wonderful. She was able to see this as part of a phenomenon and not simply a way of reading the text, but also a phenomenon of language, of engagement with the world. So there is still, I think, a fertile ground there that needs plowing.
Okay. I think Margaret is talking about transdisciplinarity here, which I totally agree with. But something that I find a bit more limiting is in terms of what she mentioned earlier about access, open access. We might talk about open access, but we know that when we talk about Africana biblical interpretation, there's a difference between the biblical interpretation on the African continent and the African diaspora, and the in terms of the geopolitical or socioeconomic differences in both spaces. So now, what is limiting? What I find limiting for those of us on the African continent, in spite of the open access, is the paucity of literature that we have to build on here. Yes, we can borrow from our comrades in the diaspora and try to compare, but because there are still differences anyway, then that becomes limiting when we don't have sources that go further back. Most of the things we build on are like 30 years, maybe a few 40 years, and that's all. So for upcoming scholars, that's quite limiting when you don't have enough to work on from this end.
I feel like one of the exciting areas for African American biblical interpretation that's really generating some good publications has to do with Vincent Wimbush's push for looking at the not necessarily only, as you mentioned, Margaret, the data-driven sociological study of living interpreters, but also the voices of African Americans across our history. And I think there have been great publications recently that push for looking at those voices. And what's particularly exciting about that is its relevance to today. I think that biblical studies sometimes voices an anxiety of irrelevance, to say, oh, how are we going? What are we going to do to make sure that our discipline stays important or has some meaning to those outside of small circles of academics? And the type of cultural study or reception history or whatever you want to call it that is happening in African American biblical studies has connected with a current moment of people saying, hey, how can Black people use the resources that we have access to change ideologies that will influence us in a positive way right now, considering existential threats to Black life? And in biblical studies, I don't know that a lot of subdisciplines in biblical studies are thinking about that, but Africana Biblical Studies has resources that go towards that. And so I find that very exciting. And it also fits with something that I heard from multiple people today about how your introduction to and interest in Africana biblical interpretation has had something to do with the fact that it seemed relevant to you, coming from the Caribbean, coming from thinking about where are the queer voices and people are being murdered in mob violence. Like these are the questions that inform us, and it makes a difference in terms of what research we do. And fortunately, I think that that's exciting because it's impactful in ways that other areas of biblical studies aren't automatically impactful. I don't know much about tenure.
Let me say too, I appreciate you talking about it being impactful, because I think, and I don't know how Margaret and Herbert feel about this, but coming through, most of my professors didn't care if there was any relevance at all to what was going on in the text and what was happening in the present.
No, I agree. Since you raised it, Michael, I agree. Most of my professors weren't interested in that. They were interested in this academic question that they understood as disconnected from the real lived world. And because it was disconnected from the real lived world, it was pristine, and that was the object. I think I only had one professor in my graduate program who was concerned about the so what question, and that was, of course, Renita Weems. But certainly, in seminary, both Randy Bailey and Charles Colfer were always interested in those questions and would push us toward the so what question, and what are the consequences for real lived experiences. And I think that for African biblical interpretation, one of the characteristics that makes it unique is that we hold that question as a significant criteria for doing the work. And so in many ways, it is antagonistic to another part of a large enterprise in terms of its motivations and impetuses. And I think that's a good thing.
So Vincent was my doctor father, so that was kind of a guiding question at Union, obviously. In fact, he's the one who taught me to read text that way. I remember reading Burton Mack's book or somebody else's book, and he would say, yes, but there's no conversation whatsoever about what's going on in the world around at this time. And, that was such a constant drumbeat behind his work that kind of so what question was a driving question. It's kind of why it was hard for me to find a dissertation topic, because what I really wanted to do was something Caravana, but I couldn't find the resources. And I didn't know where to look, and I didn't have anyone to guide me in that direction. And that was a so what question for me. Why is this relevant if I'm not doing something that matters? But I hear what you're saying, because I will tell you that my colleagues here at Austin Seminary, and here where I teach, I'm in the unusual position of having 3 other colleagues, all of whom are of color in Bible, at a white seminary. And all of them would say exactly what Herbert and Michael just said, especially the one who graduated from Harvard, that this particular question was a non-starter. As to tenure, I think part of the tenure issue, I know some schools are getting rid of it, but for those schools that do have it, I think it is incumbent upon those of us who have made it through to that point to be accessible to junior scholars and to make sure that we have their backs. Yeah. Because absolutely. We have to be the arbiters of what is acceptable work. We cannot allow that to be simply something that white folks do. Right. We have to be able to say from our positions with our full titles, President Michael Brown, Professor Herbert Marbury. We need to be able to say with that fullness that, we are scholars, we are senior in the discipline, and this is excellent work in the discipline that's moving the discourse. It's on our shoulders to do that. So to the extent that people are in places with tenure, it's the job, I think, of the senior members of our guild who are of color, and we're still a very small minority, but we're not as small as when my father did his PhD, when he could count everybody on 2 hands back in the 80s. So.
No, I fully agree. I would certainly echo what both you, Margaret, and Michael, and certainly what Justin has said. I think it's absolutely important that that we take up the mantle and become arbiters and advocates, really, rather than gatekeepers, because in doing so, we help move the field in ways that and toward the direction of the questions of younger scholars. I remember I came along at a time when I think we're probably on the cusp of being free enough to ask different questions. When I came along, the dissertation was still my initiation into the academy, and so I still, at that point, had to demonstrate my historical, critical, and philological chops, if you will. I'm so glad that day has passed in many quarters. So I didn't get to write the book I wanted to write with my dissertation. I didn't get to write that book until I wrote Pillars years later, and I could respond to questions, and specifically I remember responding to questions from in Blackening the Bible, questions that Vincent Wimbush had asked in Africans and African Americans in the Bible, and questions that Hugh Page had asked in the Africana Biblical Commentary. And so I took those as the impetuses for my project I wanted to write, and it felt good to be able to take as those impetuses mandates from 3 African American scholars. All right. So let's move to next question. What would you say are the contributions of Africana biblical interpretation to the discipline of biblical studies as a whole? And as I pose that question, I'd like for us to not to conceive of the discipline of biblical studies as a whole as somehow centering the historical critical enterprise that arose from the Enlightenment Project. So I hope we can think of the discipline of biblical studies far more broadly in terms of post-colonial studies, in terms of minoritized biblical criticism, in terms of the various contextual studies that we engage today, and I would say also that certainly the historical critical enterprise is also a contextual study. We rarely identify it that way, but it is merely a contextual study, one that's often been antagonistic to our own cultural survival, but a contextual study nonetheless.
If I can speak briefly, I would say one of the big things is what you just pointed out in asking the question. An important contribution has to do with the contextualization of interpreters, of making it apparent to those who are learning biblical studies that, hey, every approach in this discipline is informed by contextualized interpreters. And Africana biblical interpretation is not the only one who has pushed for this idea, but for me, in terms of teaching the classroom, it serves as a helpful example for showing students that idea. I'm able to draw from, I think, Mitzi Smith's Introduction to Insights into African American Biblical Interpretation. I think that's the title, but it's an introductory work that's kind of recent. And in the introduction to that book, she points out from the very beginning the importance of the person doing the interpretation and how that makes a difference in terms of what's pulled out of the text. And the difference is not just a matter of interest. I'm sorry, that's not the best word. It's not just a matter of that which is fascinating. The differences that she starts with have to do with power in terms of slavery. Actually, her in the beginning of Pillar of Fire and Cloud, you do something similar with the book being silent for, and I forget how to say his last name.
Ukasa Groniasa, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Sure.
And it's the same idea that he perceives the book and has to speak for it. The white enslaver perceives the book and has to speak for it, and who they are makes a huge difference in terms of how they speak for the book. And for my students who are just learning about biblical interpretation, that's huge, because I'm telling them you can't just hide behind, well, this is what it says. You have to take some responsibility, and we all do. So to me, that's one of the huge contributions that I take when I teach biblical studies. I'm not just talking about Africana biblical interpretation, but I use us and our readings as an example to say, hey, this is an important component of interpreting the Bible for anybody in any context.
And I think you can trace that from Stony the Road to the 2-volume set that, the 3-volume set that Fernando and Marianne Tolbert, Fernando Segovia and Marianne Tolbert put out in 1993, which I think was a pivotal text for those of us coming into seminary at that time, the Reading from This Place set, because that set was exactly that discussion, was shifting to saying everybody is coming from a place, right? And everybody ought to be owning that place and considering how that place affects the way we read. I think also thinking the importance of autobiography allows us to see different things and to ask different questions, right? When you're an immigrant and you're reading a text about people moving, you ask different questions than when you have been raised in a country all your life. When you are a person who has been minoritized and you see another person being minoritized in a text, you ask different questions than a person who's been in the majority all your life. When you are a woman reading a text, or when you are queer reading a text, you ask different questions from your own lived experience. And if those questions are not invalidated, and you are given permission, or you take permission, because sometimes you have to take permission that hasn't been given to you, and ask the impertinent question. But when you take those questions and those questions are invited or you make them valid, then it changes the way you read. And it not only changes the way we read, it changes the way everybody else reads. We cannot unread things now.
I agree. I agree. I'm sorry. Do you want to go ahead, Fumala?
Oh, you go.
Okay. When I was working on blackening, I decided to teach the class on interpretation only using Black scholars. And they weren't doing anything different per se. I mean, they were still, Cofer's still a historian, Bailey's still a literary critic. I mean, and but the resistance I got, even from the Black students. And so it wasn't until like halfway through the course that I think people got it. They started to understand what it meant to be a contextualized reader, but it was very rough at first, and it was really puzzling to me because the only difference was color. That was it.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with what we've been saying, that context matters. That's one thing that Africana biblical interpretation has brought to the table. And for me, I would say this particular type of interpretation, it shows the whole world or the whole guild that no single group or no single generation has a monopoly of interpretation, and that there is no superiority of interpretation. So because you do historical criticism, it does not make contextual criticism inferior. So I think the insistence of Black voices in these last 3 decades to be heard has shown that, yes, context matters, but there is no superiority here. And we are going to continue to be heard, I suppose. Then the issues of post-coloniality, decoloniality, womanist interpretation, those are things, the critical contributions of African biblical interpretation. Of course, this is done with other voices from the margin, like from Asia and other spaces. But context matters. I think that is the very central part of the contribution of ABI.
Yeah, I want to say that historical criticism is what got me where I am as far as looking at imperialism. And so what was meant to stop us from thinking outside of this box that they try to put us in really uncovered a lot of things in scripture for us. And we need to speak about it because and we do, because it is in that context that you find the imperialism, you find the racism, you find those hidden voices, those hidden things. Like Michael, when you were talking about blackening, when I brought that to my students at Shaw, it was the same kind of things. Like, oh, no, he wasn't black, they wasn't black. You know, Solomon didn't marry no black woman. You know, and so I just see that sometimes when things are put into place to block you, I think as people of color and as people of different genders and different persuasions are able to see how we can use that to really uncover some things that I really think that people were trying to hide. I look at scripture and I'm very suspicious and look at what are they trying to hide? What are you not saying? You know, why did you say it that way? You know, and I try to get my students to see that. Look at how they said that. You know, why did they use that Greek interpretation? You know, that word. You know, that kind of thing. So I just want to thank you, Michael, for that book because I like to shock my students, and that really brought out some stuff with them. And I had one student even cry because she was upset with what she had been taught. She's like, are you serious? I'm saying, Dr. Michael Brown said so, it's good.
So Annie, would you say that you're using the master's tool to pull down the master's house then?
Yes, ma'am. That's what we've been doing since they brought us over here.
I think within that, there's also the potential to rearrange our relationships with power, right? We're talking about the way that we have been given the syllabi and our ability to choose other scholars, right? I'm kind of thinking about one of Randy Bailey's tirades, like, you got all these scholars who are writing on the work, why aren't you citing those scholars? Like we're able to actually recanonize or organize, to redo something that has been done, but to create the council of scholarship that we're going to consult for the purpose that we have. I think that that's a very different kind of orientation toward the scholarship. I think in terms of these relationships with power, to Margaret's point about being able to be kind of like ambassadors and arbiters and not gatekeepers, I think that that's a choice. I think that those are opportunities. I think that it's a way that Africana people can be in the world, which is very different than this Dr. Mutter, Dr. Fatah kind of, hazing kind of way that we've seen before. And I think it's also relationship with community, right? Again, Margaret, what is your community of accountability, right? In this, what is your community of accountability? How are you showing up? And what is your public facing scholarship saying to real live flesh and blood readers as we visit churches, as we visit community groups, as we speak in webinars and participate on panels? There's a way that Africana kind of can exist in an otherwise, to kind of borrow from Gerald West and other folks, an otherwise way of being. And I think that that is Those are the big contributions to biblical studies from Africana biblical interpretation.
Let me add two others. One is a redefinition of reception history. And I'm thinking of what Justin was talking about earlier too. Reception history for so long has traced itself through the Protestant white church and how the Protestant white church has attended to the question of how the Bible should be read pre and post Holocaust and perhaps after Vatican II, right? Adding the Catholics in on that. Africana biblical interpretation has said Old Elizabeth is reception history. Frederick Douglass is reception history. Harriet Tubman is reception history. Sojourner Truth is reception history. And Otis Moss is reception history. King is reception history. Septima Clark is reception history. That we don't have to limit reception history to white Protestant churches. Reception history comes through particular lines of people, right? So in the Caribbean, I would say William Watty, Joyce Bailey. I would say Horace Russell of blessed memory, who just passed. These are reception history. I would say Noel Dexter, the hymn writer, is reception history because he is reinterpreting text through the lens of Caribbean language and culture to make hymnody for the people. That is reception history. So we have exploded what that means. The other thing I want to hold up, and I don't think we can have this conversation without calling her name, the good Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, creativity, the audacity of creativity. The way in which Will has fundamentally shaped the womanist question, whether or not you agree with her, is both audacious and extremely creative. And her brilliance in Hebrew Bible has forced other people to pay attention. So I think we need to talk about the way in which just the plain creativity and the audacity of that creativity is a gift that we have given to the Academy also.
And I'd like to, what comes to mind with what we're saying is that it's a kind of a touchy point with some people is the term Africana. And that's what, when Benny asked me to do this, it brought me back a little bit because many Black Americans do not identify with Africa. And so when we have to, I think we have to be careful in that, I read Callahan's book, The Talking Book, and how he terms it as we are children of slavery. And that's where our history actually began. And so I just want to put that out there. Not that everybody agrees with that. I'm just saying that that is something.
I would add something in that line of definitions of what Africana is. For those who identify as Africana, then I think another contribution of African biblical interpretation is this idea that, okay, if we consider the Bible as a kind of universal text now, it's used everywhere by many people all over the globe and also historically as well. The fact that modern interpreters from Africa or the Africana interpreters are able to say, yes, this text is not just a universal document. There are African voices in the text itself. And if African voices and African people or Africana people, if you want to stick to the term, are represented in the text, then the voices of their offspring should not be muted also. That's, they have to be heard, and those voices have to be heard loud and clear as well. So I think interpreters, modern interpreters, people like Adamo, they brought that to the fore, and they fought all their academic life to ensure that they were heard, that Africana people are not muted. So I think that's a big contribution as well.
All right, well, thank you all for a robust, engaging, and thoughtful conversation thus far. I think we turn to our final question. This is sort of a, where are we going? How my mind has changed? How my house remained the same? And what are next steps? Sort of question. But how can the discipline of biblical studies become more diverse and inclusive, and not just biblical studies as a whole, but Africana biblical studies in particular? So how can the large enterprise expand, but how can we do some self-critique, some introspection here, and think about ways that our own enterprise might need to expand? Where are the edges, in other words, where we marginalize?
I don't know if this is really happening, but if we can listen more to each other. We're not a mono person. And so you don't all think the same about certain things, but sometimes we're afraid. I know that when I've come into the academy kind of late, I taught in elementary school, high school, whatever, had children, then came back. And so the voices that we have right in this room itself, being able to listen to each other and critique each other without getting, I've had so many people who have come into my life, through the academy that have been very supportive, and I have been tentative to speak about certain things. They've encouraged me, Margaret, to speak. Just speak, and I'm seeing that if we can continue on that path where we can accept each other for who we are and not fall into that trap of the crab in the barrel kind of thing, but the identity thing, we don't have to identify, we can just be.
What I have to offer is not as much a critique of an area for self-improvement as a celebration of something I've seen in the past and I think is continuing to make the discipline more diverse and inclusive. And that is, Eric mentioned, what are we doing with our public-facing scholarship? And Annie mentioned Will Gaffney's work. And when I think about that sort of thing, I know I've talked to current scholars who will say, Renita Weems' Just a Sister Away really gave me the idea, hey, this is something I could be a part of, I could be involved in. And I feel the same way when I share Will Gaffney's Womanist Midrash with not just students, but I share it with people in churches. Because I feel like this is a way in which biblical scholarship can be very thorough with the work that she does, and also accessible to people who are not just at seminary. And I think about that. I think about Yolanda Norton's Beyonce Mass. And I think about these as things where someone who people who have diverse interests and ideas might see that and say, oh, biblical scholarship might be a space where who I am is welcome. And that's before ever, already getting one of these degrees. These are people that are outside of those spaces. And so I think that is one thing that some of us are already doing well that will continue to contribute to bringing in diverse and inclusive voices.
if there's gonna, I don't know if this is, I wouldn't say this is a self-critique, but I will say from what I've noticed from my vantage point is that quite often, African Americans and other people of African descent don't realize that they actually have an interest in biblical studies until sometimes like their second year in seminary. And unfortunately, given the language issues, that it's like almost too late. And if you look at our competitive PhD programs, I mean, let's just be honest, there's a secret time limit. If you're over a certain age, they're not going to take you, you know? And so I think that we're going to have to, that's going to be something we're going to have to negotiate in the future. You know, how we're going to introduce languages earlier, if that's the way we're going to do it, or I mean, or some other way. I'm not trying to be heretical here in that sense, but as long as we require this kind of old school language acquisition, then I think we're barring the inclusiveness we're really trying to get after.
I so agree with you, because now that I'm teaching the language rather than studying the language, you go to Blue Letter Bible or all these things there, and you can just interpret it, you know, and see all these different ways to use it. And I think it may have been, and I'm suspicious, deliberately done to hamper people, or to cause people to not study, go into biblical studies. Because I was told that is the most difficult PhD to get. And because they said that, of course, I pursued it. But, you know, that's the mindset that I had, that, you know, these languages, and not only that, you know, you had to have 2 modern languages, you know, but you can take them over the summer, you know, so how important could it be if you can take it over summer? But but it was just these stipulations that I put it in our place.
Yeah, I've got to ditto that question about the languages. The gift at ITC was that we had a whole year to teach Greek and a whole year to teach Hebrew. And as long as we had a Presbyterian seminary, that wasn't going away, because the Presbyterians needed it. But the side effect of that was that we were able to give students enough time to actually sit with what is this language and how does it function. And we were able, as a result, to prepare folk like a Herbert Marbury, like an Eric Thomas, to go on to do doctoral work. Even here at a Presbyterian seminary, where all our Presbyterian students have to do 2 languages, they get 1 semester, and it is fast. And then they don't pick it up again. Unless they're coming in with languages, they don't have a chance of entering PhD work from here. You know, so this question of languages and language acquisitions may actually be a question of attending to the churches and saying to the churches, if you want scholars in Bible, we need to teach language, and maybe setting up language courses in the churches, because that may be the only way to get folk ready to get into seminary. Seminaries are cutting language options left and right in this country. And classics departments are disappearing from places like Howard.
Let me say just really quickly and say, as an administrator, that is true. But just in particular, theological education is under so much pressure now that it is really difficult to determine in some ways which way to go, right? And we have to be a lot more creative, and that's one of the things we're trying to think through here, is how do we include language acquisition, even though it's not required for ordination. And that's usually how you get those classes, right, that they're required for ordination. Even though it's not required for ordination, how do we introduce language, right? And I think, and Margaret, that might be a good point. We have a lay leadership institute that we just launched, and that might be, there may be a possibility, there may be possibilities there we can introduce people to biblical languages. You know, but it's a necessity if we want people of color to continue to come into the guild.
And that's it exactly, Michael. I think the gift of the Black church in particular, to the extent that I can speak to that, having been at ITC for 14 years, is a very strong lay leadership and a deep passion about the Bible. And if you go to the pastor and you say, you know, you've got some creative young people who should be thinking about becoming professors of Bible, we need to get them in languages. And let's get some languages going on this church. I think you'll find a lot of the church mothers will come along with. The last time I taught Greek here online, I had 5 people auditing the text just because they wanted to. They were not even taking it for credit. One was a grandmother in a Black Southern Baptist church who just always wanted to know. So I think we underestimate, and this is also the way in which we talk about ourselves, right? We underestimate that these languages are not esoterica for the church. It's something that especially in the Black church, people are walking around calling God Jehovah Jireh now, with all of the problematic of that. But they're pulling like Jehovah Sabaoth, and I want to have a Rhema word. They care about these things, right? This is something that's part of the tradition of the church, but we're not offering to like correct and shape that in any way. So I would say go for it.
Margaret, what I think though is the way that it's taught is a big problem. You know, it's just like being like, I took French for 7 years, you know, and it only rang to me when that song Marmalade, Voulez-vous coucher? I was like, what? Okay. So when it became relevant, and I think that needs to be the part of teaching language. It has to show relevance immediately. Otherwise, you lose people.
You're absolutely right. I remember teaching the perfect tense. I don't know if you were in this class, Eric. I don't know. Kevin McKeithen was in the class. This is who I remember. I was teaching the perfect tense at ITC, and Kevin was in the back row, and he's just flips his locks at me and says, "Doc, I have verbed. Who has verbed? Who talks like this?" And you know, it was. And here I'm gonna call on God. It was a God moment. I turned back to him and I said, I have been to the mountaintop and I have looked over. And you know, this is ITC. By the time I got to I have seen the promised land, they were having a praise service. Class is over. But then we were able to stop and say, okay, what is the difference between I went to the mountaintop and I have been to the mountaintop? And all of a sudden, the perfect tense clicked in a way that it would not have if it was not culturally relevant. So you're exactly right.
Can I just jump in and perhaps embarrass Margaret to this point about languages? I think that one of the most significant moments in my entire life, and I'm going to be 53 on June 23rd, was when we were in our Greek class and we had this whole, we celebrated communion, and the text was written in Greek on the board, and Margaret performed the communion for our Greek class. And there's something about I pass on to you what has been passed on to me as we sat in the Charles Kofer room and the Hugh Page room. Like there's something about the shoulders upon which we stand, who were told you're Black and you can't do Bible. You're Black and you can't do languages. You're Black and you don't know what this Hebrew is. And for us to be able to recognize those words and those verbs and those phrases and participate in this original language was something that you can only imagine what that must have been like to be a part of that. And I can't wait to stand in front of a class to say, I pass on to you what has been passed on to me. And I think that that's the power of Africana biblical interpretation. As it has to, we'll figure ourselves out with the languages, and we'll figure ourselves out with the tenure. But I mean, this whole I pass on to you what has been passed on to me for the purpose that you can go out, go ye therefore, and pass it on to others, I think is the power and the potential.
Eric, I think you have given us an appropriate last word. So thank you all for your contributions. I particularly thank Latoya for all the work that you've done to make this conversation possible. Thank you, Benny Lou, for the invitation and for bringing together the panel. I want to thank all of you for your contributions to the conversation. Certainly this has been insightful, it's been robust, engaging. Thank you more so for your contributions to the field and your ongoing commitment to perpetual inclusiveness. That is, opening the doors for those who are to come behind us and dismantling those structures that constrain us. And thank you also for doing what I call, and I think this is what we all do in Africana Biblical Studies, the work of facing down the empire. And I look forward to spaces and the places where this conversation and our work will. Thank you all.
Thank you, Herb.
We thank you, Herbert.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here.